I no longer counted the days. Time in that place was not measured by the sun, but by levels of despair. I think it had been 40, maybe 50 days since I last saw my Yusef's face, not as the face of my husband, but as something they forced us to look at before. Now, my world was a room of damp stone, maybe 4 by 5 meters, which I shared with my 2 children, Rana and David, and 9 other women. The smell was what broke us first, even before the hunger. It was a sour smell of old fear, of sweat, of sickness, and of the bucket in the corner that served as a latrine. I spent the waking hours, and I was almost always awake, tracing the mold patterns on the ceiling, trying not to think, trying not to remember. I was no longer Miriam, the professor's wife. I was an animal curled up in the dark, and my only function was to use my body heat to try to keep my children alive for one more night, although I no longer knew why. Rana, my 16-year-old daughter, was beside me. She hadn't spoken since the 3rd night. Not a word. She just looked at me with eyes that seemed 1,000 years old, hollow and lifeless. David, 14, was on the other side, shaking. The fever had been consuming him for days, and his breathing was a shallow, painful wheeze. I tore off pieces of the hem of my dress to wipe his face. But what good is wiping away the dirt when the sickness comes from inside, from the contaminated water and the lack of everything? I had given up praying for rescue. I had given up praying for justice. My prayers in the last few days had become something horrible. I asked God that if we were to die, it would be quick, and that it would take all 3 of us together. I could not bear the idea of them taking them. That thought was worse than death. It was the only thing that still made me feel anything beyond hunger and cold. That night, something was different. The air outside our heavy metal door did not have the usual oppressive stillness. There were screams, and they were not the usual cries of a bored guard tormenting someone. They were distant screams, but urgent, filled with panic. And then, the sound. A low sound, a boom that made the stone floor vibrate beneath us. The other women sat up, their eyes wide in the dark. Was it thunder? It wasn't raining. It was a bomb. Far away, but close enough to shake the foundations of our prison. David stopped shaking and grabbed my arm with a strength I didn't know he still had. "Mother?" he whispered, his voice cracked. I had no answer. I just pulled him closer, pulled Rana, trying to cover both of them with my body. The chaos outside increased. More booms, gunshots. Not the single shots of someone's execution, but bursts, like a battle. The panic in the corridor was audible now. We could hear boots running, orders being shouted in Arabic. They were no longer in control. Something was happening. Something was attacking them. And amidst the noise, I heard a sound that froze my blood. The sound of keys. The heavy metallic sound of our own door being unlocked. We dragged ourselves to the darkest corner. A huddle of trembling bodies. The door creaked open. A guard I had never seen before, a boy, not much older than Rana, with terrified eyes, shone a flashlight on us. "Get up, all of you! We're moving you!" he yelled, but his voice was failing. He was terrified. He grabbed the first woman near the door and dragged her out. Then he grabbed another. The corridor was chaos, smoke stung my eyes, and I could see flames somewhere down the hall. The boy guard came back, grabbed my arm, and pulled me hard. "Move!" I stumbled, pulling David and Rana with me. "My children!" I screamed. "They stay!" he growled. But then another boom, closer, made the ceiling shake and dust rain down on us. The guard flinched, and for a second, he looked at David, feverish, and Rana, catatonic. He let go of us. "Go to the courtyard! Go!" he screamed, before turning to lock the empty cell. But he didn't. He ran, leaving us there, in the open corridor, with the door of our cell wide open. For a second, or maybe 10, we were paralyzed. The corridor was filled with a gray smoke that burned our eyes and scratched our throats. The screams were louder now, a mixture of orders and agony. The boy guard disappeared into the haze. The other women from our cell, the ones he dragged out, were also gone. The door of our prison was open, a black rectangle both inviting and terrifying. Instinct screamed to go back inside, into the familiar dark, the mold, and the bucket. The known, even if horrible, seemed safer than that flame-lit chaos. But David coughed, a dry, weak sound, and the spell broke. "Courtyard," I said, more to myself than to them. The guard had said, "Courtyard." It was a destination. It was the only thing we had. I grasped David's bony hand. "Get up, Habibi. You need to walk. Now." He tried, but his legs gave way. I pulled him up, throwing his arm over my shoulders. With my other hand, I grabbed Rana's wrist. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. Her eyes were fixed, looking through me, through the walls. I was carrying the weight of all three of us. Taking the first step out of the cell was like jumping into a river of fire. The air was hot. The sound of gunshots was deafening, seeming to come from inside my head. The corridor was a vision of hell. Guards were running, but not toward us. They were running toward the noise, toward the courtyard, their weapons drawn. No one looked at us. We were invisible, rats fleeing under the boots of men fighting for their lives. I saw one of the guards, an older man I recognized, one who used to laugh while denying us water, fallen near another door. There was a dark stain growing on his chest, and his eyes were open, surprised. I looked away, pulling my children to step over his outstretched legs. Rana stumbled, her inert body almost knocking me down, but I held her with the strength of despair. I couldn't fall. If I fell, David wouldn't have the strength to get up. If I fell, Rana would just stay there. I was the only thing keeping them moving. The smoke grew thicker with every step. David began to choke, his feverish cough turning into a suffocating fit. I stopped him, pressing his face against my shoulder, trying to use my own body as a filter. "Breathe slowly, my love. Slowly." But how can one breathe slowly when the world is ending? Pieces of the ceiling were falling. We could see the night sky through a jagged hole above us, an orange, sickly sky from the fires. The smell of gunpowder mixed with something else, something sweet and chemical. And then, a different sound, the whiz of bullets flying down the corridor, coming from the direction of the courtyard. They hit the stone walls with dry cracks, sending splinters that struck my face. They weren't shooting at us. It was stray fire. The battle was happening out there. We were not being rescued. We were simply in the middle of something, an obstacle, and the courtyard where the guard sent us, that was where the bullets were going. We reached the end of the corridor where a large, now battered metal door opened onto the courtyard. The scene I saw made me stop. It was not a rescue. It was not the army. It was more of them. They were men shouting Allahu Akbar, but their flags were different. Their uniforms. No, they weren't uniforms. It was just more chaos. Trucks were on fire. I saw bodies, many bodies, both guards and prisoners who had been taken out before us. They were piled near the main gate. The guard was not sending us to safety. He was sending us to the gathering point, maybe to be used as human shields, or maybe just to be grouped before being moved. And now, that gathering point was a death trap. Men were shooting from the battlements, from the tops of the walls. The courtyard was a killing field lit by fire. I pulled my children back into the shadow of the door. Behind us was our burning cell. Ahead was the courtyard of death. We were trapped. I squeezed myself against the wall, pulling David and Rana to me. My entire body was shaking violently. The courtyard was not an option. It was suicide. Going back to the cell was being burned alive. The fire behind us was hotter. The plaster from the ceiling was falling in slabs. I looked desperately down the corridor. There were other cell doors, all heavy metal, all certainly locked. But about 10 meters back, toward the densest smoke, I saw it. A wooden door. One I had never noticed. Perhaps a closet, a storage room. It was far from the shooting. It was a chance, a 1 in a million chance. "Mother, I can't breathe," David wheezed, his fingers clutching my arm. The smoke was slowly killing us. The bullets in the courtyard would kill us quickly. I chose the smoke. "This way," I yelled, though there was no sound but my own ragged breath. I stood up, putting David onto my back, grabbed Rana's arm, and plunged back into the fog we had just left. Those 10 meters felt like an eternity. The smoke was so thick that my eyes teared up so much I was blind. I guided myself by the stone wall, dragging my fingernails across it. The heat was intense on my back. The fire must have been advancing fast. David was a dead weight, his fever making him limp. Rana stumbled, an automaton being dragged. Finally, my hand hit the wood. The door. I grabbed the metal doorknob. It was hot, but not enough to burn my skin. I turned it. Locked. Of course, locked. A sob of despair escaped me. I slammed my shoulder against it, but it was solid wood. I was nothing. Behind me, the chaos in the courtyard changed. The sound of the shots got closer, as if the combatants were entering our corridor. We were out of time. I screamed, an animal sound of pure rage and fear, and pounded the door with my useless fists. Then, something struck the door from the other side. It wasn't a shot. It was a dull, heavy impact that made the wood tremble. And again. A boom that sounded like thunder. Someone was banging to get in. I scrambled back, falling over my own feet, pulling my children. Who was out there? More of them? More enemies? A piece of the door, near the lock, cracked and splintered open. And again. The whole door exploded inward in a cloud of splinters and plaster dust. I threw myself over the children, shielding their heads from the flying wood. When the dust settled, a silhouette stood in the hole. It was not one of our guards. This man was enormous, wearing dirty civilian clothes and a helmet. He was holding a sledgehammer. He looked at the flaming corridor, then at us on the ground, and his eyes, visible through the soot, widened. He shouted something, but it wasn't Arabic. I didn't understand a word. He didn't wait for an answer. The man rushed forward, grabbed my arm, and pulled me up with a force that almost dislocated my shoulder. He shoved me through the broken doorway and yelled, "Children!" He bent down, picked up David as if he were a sack of grain, and threw him to me. I caught him. He went back, grabbed Rana, who was huddled, and pushed her through too. "Run!" he shouted, this time in broken, harsh Arabic. "Run! The building is coming down!" On the other side of the door was not a closet. It was another corridor, dark, but the air was different. It wasn't smoke. It was cold dust and the smell of damp earth. It was a basement. The man didn't follow us. He turned around, raised the sledgehammer, and ran back into the flaming corridor, yelling someone's name. I didn't know who he was, whether he was an angel or just a man from another faction. I didn't care. I grabbed my children in the darkness and started running away from the sound of the battle. The darkness in that basement was total, absolute. It was thicker than the smoke we had come from. The fire and the gunshots, which seconds ago were my universe, now seemed distant, a dull, muffled boom coming from somewhere above and behind me. The air here was cold, and the smell of wet earth and mold was so strong it almost made me gag. I could see absolutely nothing, not even the outline of my own hand in front of my face. For a moment, panic paralyzed me in a new way. It wasn't the fear of fire, but the fear of the void. Was I blind? Were we buried alive? Had the man, the angel, whoever he was, saved us or condemned us to a grave? Mother. David's wheeze brought me back. He was alive. Rana was silent, but her hand was icy in mine, and I could feel the faint pulse in her thin wrist. I was the only one who could do anything. "I'm here. Hold on to me. We're going to walk," I whispered. I didn't know where to. I just knew we couldn't stay still near that broken door. I stretched out my free hand and found a wall. It was rough stone, damp and slippery. The floor beneath my feet was not level. It was packed earth, full of loose stones and icy puddles that soaked the rags on my feet. I put David in front of me, keeping his hand on my shoulder. I grabbed Rana's wrist again, and I started walking, dragging one foot in front of the other, my hand sliding along the stone wall. It was my only guide. The sound of our breathing was terribly loud in that silence. David's cough echoed strangely, as if we were in a tunnel. With every step, I expected to hit a dead-end wall. With every step, I expected to fall into a hole. My mind was screaming, "Where am I? What is this place? And above all, where was that man? Why did he throw us here and go back to the fire?" The thought that he went to save someone else, maybe his own family, gave me a pang of something that wasn't fear. It was a dark understanding. We were alone in this. No one else was coming. We walked for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only minutes. The weight of David was becoming impossible. He could barely lift his feet, and I was dragging him more than guiding him. My own exhaustion was a heavy, soaking blanket. I stopped, panting, the cold sweat mixing with the tunnel's humidity. "I can't, Mother. Leave me here," David mumbled, his voice thick with fever. "No, you are not saying that," I snarled, the ferocity surprising me. I shook him. "You are going to walk. For your father. Walk." I didn't know if it was the right thing to say, but it worked. He let out a groan and took a step, and that's when I felt it. The air. It had changed. There was an air current, weak, but it was coming from ahead of us. It brought a different smell. Not just mold, but night. Night air. And the muffled sound of the battle was slightly clearer, but it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from ahead of us and above. The floor began to slope upward. The packed earth gave way to uneven, broken steps, carved into the rock itself. They were steep and treacherous in the darkness. I climbed the first one, pulling Rana, pushing David. It was a climb. Every step was agony. My thigh muscles burned as if on fire. David fell to his knees, and I pulled him up, my arm almost coming out of its socket. I was crying, but the tears were silent, just more water on my dirty face. God, help me. God, give me strength. Just a little more. I wasn't praying for deliverance. I was praying for the strength for the next step. And then my head hit something. No, it didn't hit. My hand, which I kept stretched upward, found nothing. The ceiling was gone. I looked up and saw it. It wasn't the moon. It wasn't the sun. It was a square of dark purple sky, polluted by the distant smoke of the fires, but it was the sky. It was open air. It was an opening. A metal grate, maybe. It was maybe 3 or 4 meters above us. It was the way out. I stood there, my neck aching from looking up at that square of dirty sky. Hope was a double-edged sword. It gave me a glimpse of freedom, but it also made our stone prison 1,000 times more unbearable. The opening was too high, maybe 3 meters, and it looked like a ventilation grate or the exit of an old sewer, covered by thick, rusted metal bars. I could hear the wind, a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. A low howl that seemed to mock me. And mixed with the wind, the distant but unmistakable sound of gunshots and screams. The battle, or whatever it was still happening. We weren't safe. We were just in a different trap. I could smell the smoke, not the suffocating smoke of the corridor, but the smoke of distant buildings burning. It was the smell of the outside world. I had to reach it. "Help me. We have to climb," I said, my voice a scratch. I tried to find support on the stone wall. It was useless. The dampness made it slippery as glass. There were no cracks, no ledges. I jumped, stretching my fingers as far as I could, but my hand barely made it halfway. Exhaustion and hunger had stolen all my strength. I fell back onto the muddy floor, hitting my knee on a stone. The pain was sharp, but I ignored it. I looked at Rana. She was sitting on the steps, her face a pale, empty mask in the dark. She hadn't moved. "Rana, you're lighter. I'll lift you." "You have to reach the grate." She didn't answer. Her eyes weren't focusing on me. She was lost, locked up somewhere I couldn't reach. Panic began to climb my throat, cold and acidic. I couldn't do this alone. David coughed, a gurgling sound that scared me. He was worse. The fever was winning. If I didn't get him out of that damp, cold air, he wouldn't survive until dawn, even if the battle outside stopped. The urgency gave me a strength I didn't know I had. It was the strength of rage. I turned to the wall again. I didn't need to climb the whole distance. I just needed a boost. I looked at the walls. There were loose stones on the floor. Maybe, yes. "David," I said, my voice now hard. "Wake up. I need you. Stand against the wall. No, with your back to it." He moaned, but obeyed, leaning on the stone. "Rana!" I screamed, and for the first time, the tone made her eyes blink. "Come here. Stand next to your brother." She moved, slowly, like a puppet. I positioned them, their thin bodies against the wall, side by side. They would be my steps. "Forgive me," I murmured. I placed my left foot on David's shoulder. He cried out, a weak sound of pain, but held steady. I pulled myself up, my body shaking with the effort, and placed my other foot on Rana's shoulder. I was standing on my children. Shame and necessity battled within me. The grate was within reach. I grabbed it. The bars were icy cold and rough with rust, which cut the palm of my hand. I hung on, my arms screaming in protest. I kicked my feet away from their shoulders and tried to swing my body, trying to find a footing in the opening. I wasn't strong enough. I was just hanging there, 3 meters from the ground, my hands bleeding, and the grate didn't even move. It was stuck. It was locked from the outside or sealed by rust. And I was stuck to it, without the strength to climb up and afraid to let go. I hung there, in that dark limbo, for maybe 5 seconds, or an eternity. The rust on the grate was like shark teeth, tearing the already thin skin of my palms. I could feel the warm blood running down my wrists, the smell of metal and my own blood mixed with the mold. My shoulders felt like they were being ripped from their sockets. I looked down, into the darkness where my children were. I had used my children as steps to reach a dead end. The shame was a wave of nausea so strong it almost made me let go. I had no strength left. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a mother. I was just a dying woman, hanging from a useless metal gate. My fingers, one by one, began to open. It wasn't a decision. My body simply gave up. The muscle could no longer obey. My hands opened, and I fell. The impact was brutal. I fell onto my back, hitting my head on the first stone step, and then rolling onto the dirt floor. The pain exploded at the back of my neck and shot down my spine. That knee I had hurt before screamed. The air left my lungs in a single, painful oof. I lay there, in the mud and the icy water, unable to move, unable to breathe. The taste of earth was in my mouth, so this was it. The end. I wouldn't die by fire or a bullet, but in a dark hole at the foot of an exit I couldn't reach. I thought of Yusef. "Forgive me, my love." I tried. I failed them. I heard David have another coughing fit, a weak sound, and I couldn't even turn over to touch him. Despair was no longer an emotion. It was a physical state. It was the cold earth swallowing me. I was finished. And then, in the total darkness, I heard it. It wasn't David's cough. It wasn't the battle outside. It was a word. Mother. It was a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. A sound I thought I would never hear again. It was like a shard of glass. Hoarse, dry, broken. I froze. Was I delirious? Was the pain in my head making me hear things? Mother. Again. It came from where Rana was sitting. I turned, ignoring the searing pain in my back. I couldn't see anything, but I knew she had moved. "Rana?" I whispered, and then I felt it. Her hand, not the inert wrist I was dragging, but fingers that closed around my arm, fingers that were gripping me tightly. "Get up," she said. The word was a command. My catatonic girl, my lost daughter, was there. She was back. The shock was so profound, so visceral. It was as if lightning had struck my chest, restarting my heart. I didn't even have time to process the miracle of Rana's voice, because the world ended. A deafening boom, so close it wasn't a sound. It was a force. The entire floor lifted and threw us into the air. It wasn't a boom. It was a concussion. The entire building groaned. Stones and dust rained down on us, coming from the staircase. I screamed and threw myself toward the sound of David's cough. And then, above us, came a sound of tearing metal, a long, sharp moan. The explosion outside, perhaps a car bomb at the gate, perhaps a mortar hitting the building next door, had shaken the very foundation. And the grate, that grate I couldn't move, ripped from the stone by the sheer vibration, collapsed. It fell whole, a 200-pound rectangle of iron, and smashed onto the upper steps where I had been hanging seconds before. The noise was final. And then, silence. Only the dust falling. And above us, where the grate had been, there was now a hole. A perfect open hole, showing the night sky and the open air. The dust was so thick I couldn't breathe. I choked, swallowing plaster and dirt. The silence that followed the fall of the grate lasted only a heartbeat. And then, the sound of the outside world flooded our hole like a torrent. It was pandemonium. The gunfire, the screams, the roar of the fire. Everything was incredibly close, no longer muffled by the stone. The hole was not a silent exit. It was a doorway opened into the middle of a war zone. And the air that came through it, oh God, the air. It was cold, sharp, and it smelled of night, but also of burnt gasoline and something else, something rotten and metallic. I lay there on the ground for one moment more, simply stunned. The grate that was my prison was now a pile of twisted iron on the steps. The hole was clear. The universe had just given us a chance. At the exact second I had completely given up. "I told you, Mother. Get up." Rana's voice again. I felt her hands, thin but surprisingly strong, grabbing the fabric of my clothing and pulling me. I turned and, in the faint light coming through the hole above, I saw her face for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a face. It was a skull, with skin stretched tight and eyes hollow as wells. But they weren't empty. They were on fire. There was a fury in her, a clarity that both frightened and saved me. The shock of seeing her, of hearing her, of feeling her presence, was stronger than the pain in my back. She, whom I had carried like a corpse, was now pulling me to my feet. The world had turned upside down. She wasn't healed. She was broken. But the broken part had transformed into something hard as steel. She had seen the end of the world in the depths of her own mind and had decided to come back. The fallen grate blocked the last steps, a rusty metal spider web. It wasn't a staircase. It was another trap. The opening was just above it, still almost 1.5 meters from where the grate began. For David, in his state, it would be like climbing a mountain. He was lying where I had shielded him, shaking and coughing so much it seemed his lungs would tear apart. The fever made him delirious. His eyes were half open, but he wasn't seeing anything. "We won't make it," I whispered, looking at him. Hope was fragile. Reality was a dying boy and an impossible climb. The battle outside seemed to intensify, as if it were approaching our exit. We were running out of time. "You will push him," Rana said. Her voice was flat, unemotional, a military command. She wasn't asking. She pointed at David. "I will go first. I will climb the grate and give you my hand. You will lift David to me. You will push him out." I looked at her. She barely weighed 40 kilos. "Rana, you can't—" "I will." She cut me off, and without waiting for an answer, she turned to the pile of metal. She climbed the first stone step, grabbed the twisted bars, and began to climb. Her hands and feet found footing where I only saw a chaos of iron. She moved like an insect, with an agility born of pure terror. In seconds, she was on top of the fallen grate, crouched in the hole, her thin body outlined against the smoky sky. She looked down and extended her hand. "Now, give him to me." I looked at Rana's hand, stretched out in the darkness. It was so small, covered in soot. And I looked at David, a dead weight of a 14-year-old boy, delirious with fever. "I can't, Rana, I can't lift him. He's too heavy," I sobbed. The smell of gasoline was stronger. "Push!" she screamed back. It wasn't a plea. It was an order full of rage. And the sound of that rage, coming from my silent daughter, ignited something in me. I didn't try to lift him. I put myself under him. I crouched on the muddy floor, ignored the stab of pain in my back, and placed my shoulder under his limp body. I became a lever. I screamed, a sound that tore my own throat, and pushed upward with my legs, with my back, with everything I was. I lifted him maybe 1 meter, enough for Rana to grab his armpits. He was a dead weight, a rag doll. Rana grabbed him, but she didn't have the strength to pull. She was only a point of support. "More, Mother." "Push more!" she yelled, her teeth clenched. I adjusted my position, my hands now on his feet, and pushed. I could feel my spine protesting, a hot crack near my neck, but I didn't stop. I pushed my son's body up, into the night air, centimeter by centimeter. He didn't help. His body snagged on the stone edge of the hole. Rana let go of his armpits and grabbed the waistband of his pants, pulling with a grunt. She was pulling, I was pushing, and David was in the middle, his body scraping against the stone. The sound of the battle outside was a roar now. A close explosion rained more dust on us. We were too slow. They were going to hear us. They were going to find us. With one last push, one that tore a scream of pure pain from me, David's body passed the point of balance. He wasn't pulled. He tumbled out of the hole. I heard him hit the ground up there, a dull, sickening thud. And then he was gone. He was out. I collapsed, falling to my knees on the twisted metal grate, my breath gone, the world spinning in white spots of pain. I did it. I got him out. For a second, I just lay there, panting, and the smell of the outside world hit me. It wasn't the fresh air I imagined. It was a stench. Oil smoke, cordite, something chemical that burned the nose. And the sounds. My God, the sounds. Machine gun fire, so close I could hear the casings hitting the ground. Screams in a language I didn't recognize. And the rhythmic noise, a whump, 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 that seemed to be coming from right above us, shaking my teeth. A helicopter. We were in the middle of hell. "Mother, your hand! Now!" Rana's voice pulled me out of the trance. I looked up. The opening. Freedom. My children. I pulled myself onto the unstable grate. My hands, the ones I had cut on the rust, were raw. I placed them on the stone edge. The stone was covered in small shards, but I didn't care. I hung on. I had no strength left in my legs. My climb was not a climb. It was a pathetic drag. I dragged myself, my body a useless bag of pain. My ribs hit the edge. I felt Rana's small hands grab the collar of my dress, pulling me. I threw one leg over and rolled out of the hole, falling onto a floor covered in rubble and bullet casings. I was out. I was in the open air. And for the first time, I saw where we were. It wasn't a street. It was a narrow alley, a corridor of rubble and trash squeezed between the prison's outer wall and another building. A building that was almost completely on fire. The sky I saw was not the sky of peace. It was a red-orange inferno, ripped by thick black smoke. The sound of the helicopter was not distant. It was directly above us. It was a deafening mechanical monster, so loud it made my chest vibrate and my teeth ache. A dazzling white searchlight, brighter than the sun, shot out from the belly of the machine and swept the ground. The air didn't smell of night. It smelled of aviation fuel, burning rubber, and a chemical smell that made my nose sting. The searchlight hit us, blinding us instantly, and I threw myself to the ground, covering my head. The light moved, focusing on the roof of the prison building, and that's when I saw the tracer bullets, green lines rising from the ground toward the machine in the sky, which replied with a ripping sound, a brrrt, that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. I was out of the cell, but I was in a shooting range. My first, only instinctive reaction was for my children. David was where he had fallen, a pile of rags 2 meters from me. He didn't move. My heart, which had been beating so fast, simply stopped. "David!" I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the noise. I crawled to him, my hands and knees scraping on hot bullet casings and shards of glass. I turned him over. His eyes were closed. There was a new cut on his forehead, where he hit the ground. But he was breathing. It was the faintest puff of air, an almost imperceptible movement in his chest, but it was there. The fever had taken him to a place so deep that even the sound of a war wouldn't wake him. I turned to Rana. She wasn't on the ground. She was crouched against the wall, like a cornered animal. Her eyes, those eyes. They were no longer empty. They were alive, alert, and filled with a savage fury. She wasn't looking at the helicopter. She was looking at the end of the alley. I followed her gaze. 50 meters away, where the alley met a main street, there was an armored vehicle. Men were emerging from it. They were not our guards. They were not wearing black. They were soldiers. Full gear, helmets, goggles that glowed green in the dark, weapons that looked like they came out of a movie. They moved differently, professionally, crouched, communicating by hand signals. They were the owners of the helicopter. They were the ones attacking the prison. Were they the angels who freed us? Were they American? European? I didn't know. They were shouting in English. But they weren't looking for us. They were attacking. They set up a heavy machine gun and began firing at the main entrance of the prison to our left. The searchlight in the sky swept back, looking for any movement. And it stopped, right above us. The white light pinned us like insects on a pin. "No!" Rana screamed. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a roar of defiance. At the exact moment the searchlight fixed on us, a snapping sound came from the sky. The helicopter was shooting. At us. They were not saviors. They were just death coming from another direction. To them, anything that moved in this alley was the enemy. Rana threw herself on top of me, pushing me behind a pile of rusty metal barrels. At the exact second the bullets chewed the ground where I had been. The concrete exploded, and splinters hit my back. The sound was so loud that my ears stopped working. All I heard was a sharp, painful ringing. I was lying down, paralyzed, drooling with terror. But Rana was not. She pulled me to cover. And then, before I could understand, she turned and ran back into the illuminated alley. She grabbed David by the ankles, and with a strength that shouldn't be possible, she dragged him through the dust and glass, his limp body bumping against the stones, and pulled him behind the barrels. She collapsed on top of us, her chest heaving. My broken daughter had just saved us from an attack helicopter. The three of us were huddled behind those barrels, which smelled of rancid oil. My entire body was a single exposed nerve, vibrating with the sound of the helicopter and the sharp ringing in my ears, which had replaced all other sounds. I could feel the thump, thump, thump of the propeller blades not with my ears, but with my chest. I was crushed against the metal, trying to make myself small, trying to disappear. The air was full of a fine powder of pulverized concrete that coated my tongue and made me want to cough, but I didn't dare. I looked at Rana. Her eyes were fixed on the end of the alley. She wasn't even panting. She was perfectly still, like a waiting predator. I didn't recognize my daughter. The girl I knew had died in the cell. This was someone else, a ghost forged in terror, and I didn't know whether to thank her or be afraid of her. She had saved our lives, and she looked ready to do it again. The white light of the searchlight left us. It swept the alley once more, like an eye of God searching for sinners, and then moved, fixing on the prison roof, where more shots were coming from. The helicopter hadn't seen us. It had shot on the move, and now it had a bigger target. The relief was so immediate it almost made me vomit. We were alive. For a second, I peered through a crack between the barrels. The soldiers at the end of the alley, 50 meters away, were in full battle. They were exchanging heavy gunfire with the prison guards at the main gate. They were not looking at us. The helicopter was providing cover for them. So they were the saviors? But they had just tried to kill us. The world made no sense. Nothing made sense. Behind us, the hole we came from looked like a pit to hell. Ahead of us, a battle between two armies that would kill us without a second thought. We were trapped in no man's land. "We have to go," I whispered to Rana, my mouth dry. "Where to?" she whispered back, her eyes never leaving the soldiers. She was right. There was nowhere to go. And that's when a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, a thin, strangled sound, and turned around, ready to die. But it wasn't a soldier. It was him, the man with the sledgehammer, the man who threw us into the basement. He had come out of somewhere from a shadow I didn't even know existed. His face was covered in soot, and fresh blood dripped from a cut on his arm. He put a dirty finger over his lips, silencing me. He didn't look at us. He looked at the soldiers, then at the helicopter, and his face was a mask of hatred. He was not with them. He was not with the prison guards. He was something else. A third side. Or, like us, just someone caught in the middle. He looked at us, three pathetic figures hiding behind the garbage. He saw David, unconscious on the ground. His eyes softened for an instant, a flash of humanity in that hell. He didn't speak. He pointed, not toward the end of the alley where the soldiers were, not back toward the hole, but toward a dark crack in the opposite wall, the wall of the burning building. It was a narrow passage between the two buildings, so dark it looked solid. He made a sharp gesture with his head. Go. Now. He wasn't coming with us. He crouched down, picking up a piece of metal rebar from the ground. He wasn't an angel. He was a man. A man with his own war. I didn't question it. I grabbed David's arm. Rana, help me. Together, we lifted David. He was a dead weight, his feet dragging on the rubble. We carried him, stumbling toward that crack. I looked back one last time. The man with the sledgehammer was standing, his back to us, looking at the soldiers. He was an unlikely guardian at a gate we didn't even know existed. And then we plunged into the darkness, leaving the fire and the war behind, and entered something new and unknown. That crack was narrower than I imagined. It was a service passage between the two buildings, and the walls were so close I couldn't stretch my arms out, and it was dark, a darkness as deep as the basements. But this one was different. It was a darkness that smelled of old garbage, rats, and mold. The floor was uneven, covered in debris that made my bare feet scream in pain. We could barely carry David. His shoulders scraped against both walls at the same time, and his limp body was a terrible obstacle. We have to drag him, Rana. On his back. I'll take the armpits. You take the feet. We laid him down and started moving backward, pulling him. The sound of his body scraping against the concrete and garbage was the only sound, muffling the battle that, with every step, got further away. That corridor seemed endless. It was a womb of stone and dirt, and we were blind creatures born into chaos. I don't know how long we walked. Minutes? An hour? Time had dissolved again. My arms were numb, my fingers raw. The only thing that kept me moving was the sound of Rana's breathing behind me, her rhythmic gasping as she pulled David's feet. The smell of smoke had disappeared, replaced by a sewer stench. And then, the air changed. It became colder, fresher. There was a slight upward slope. I could see, far down, a square of light. Not the orange light of the fire, but a pale blue-gray light. The light of dawn, a street, the end of the alley. Hope was a metallic taste in my mouth, almost painful. We sped up, stumbling, our last strength being burned in that final effort. We burst out of the crack and fell onto a cobblestone street, panting, a huddle of human rags. It was a narrow street, lined with tall, silent buildings. It was empty. There were no soldiers, no guards, no helicopters. It was only a block away from the battle. We could hear it clearly now, behind us, like distant thunder. But here, it was quiet. It was dawn. The first dawn I saw as a free woman, and the sky was a sickly, almost purple gray. It rained. A cold drizzle began to fall, and it was the best thing I had ever felt. I lifted my face to it, letting the dirty city water wash away the soot, the blood, and the sweat. Rana sat beside me, her body shaking violently, no longer the steel warrior, but just a 16-year-old girl freezing. David. David was exactly as before, unconscious. His pale face was wet from the rain. I dragged myself to him, placed my ear on his chest. His heart, beating. Weak, irregular, but it was there. We stayed there on the sidewalk, as the city awoke to the sound of war. The rain grew stronger. I pulled David into my lap, trying to shield him with my body. Rana huddled beside me, and I put my other arm around her. We had nowhere to go. We had no food, no water, no money. We were fugitives in a city at war. I don't know how long we stayed there. A woman opened a window above us, looked at us with hard eyes, and closed the shutters. A mangy dog growled at us from afar. I didn't feel anything. I was empty. We survived. And now, I looked at the dark hole we came from, at the man with the sledgehammer, at the explosion that opened the way, at Rana's voice coming back. Nothing made sense. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't luck. It was something else. A series of impossible coincidences. I looked at my children, one almost dead, the other reborn from trauma. I don't know what happened that night. I never knew who was fighting or why. I never saw the man with the sledgehammer again. We simply walked out. And even today, 10 years later, here in Beirut, I can't explain it. Was it God? Was it the devil? Or was it just chaos? I don't know. I only know that we entered that basement as three frightened animals, and we came out as three ghosts. And a part of us, I think, never left that darkness. Miriam's story leaves us breathless and with a question. In the midst of absolute chaos, where does human strength end and the miracle begin? Think about your own life. What was your hole in the wall? The moment when all was lost but an impossible way out appeared? Leave your opinion about this testimony here in the comments. We read every one of them. Not to miss any more transformative stories that strengthen the soul, subscribe now to the channel and activate the bell for all notifications. It is the only way YouTube will notify you. Don't leave yet. Click on the video that is now appearing on the screen to see another story we prepared for you. May God bless you and your family. Stay in peace, and until next time.